Thanks, Kaz. I want to spend a little bit of time today talking more about the topic I put forward with some hints about successful advocacy. So I'm really talking about some of the experiences and picking up thematic things out of some of my previous experiences. Give a couple of examples, some successful, some not so successful. This person, Garland, is a person who's given me a lot of inspiration over the years. That was written 15 years ago, and what he says there is so true to what's happened in the last 15 years in Australia around instrumentalities within the criminal justice system, named the Victorian Parole Board for a start. The whole thing has been redefined and has changed. Unless we see those changing movements, we might be aiming at an old target. I want to just run through some of these points that I've put forward that I suggest are some elements of what could be successful advocacy work. I think what we've already heard about from the work of Flatout and the last two speakers really addresses the first point. I mean, successful advocacy comes from direct experience. That's where your credibility comes from, being involved, being engaged, not just as a fly-by-night, but long-term. So Flatout's been going for 26 years. It's out of that experience that they reflect on the casework experience, see the systemic problems, and then have the credibility to work on those. The second, to be successful, you really have to work collegially. And there's no lone rangers. And some are good at that and some are not so good at that. But I think it's about finding networks and coordinated groups. And I'll give some examples of that later on. I think the third point's really important. I might, in my heart, I was going to say the word hate, but I might be diametrically opposed to some of the people that I'm working against or that I'm consulting with. But I think I really need to have a respectful engagement with them. And whenever I have failed in that respect, I can see the results of that. So you might have completely different views, but I think we also need to be able to engage respectfully with people. And that includes, people in politics who might be heading in the opposite direction of the one you want to head in. Unless you have that respectful engagement, and you can't feign it, then often your work is counterproductive. And fourthly, I think there's a danger sometimes in talking to ourselves, and that's why it's important to look for opportunities, particularly to broaden the public awareness and the public commitment. And that's very hard when we think about, 600,000 copies of the Herald Sun coming out every day. How do you counter that? How do you find ways of not just having our small groups? Some people say you can change the world with a small group of people. I think in order to bring about change in policy, you really need broad, widespread public awareness and commitment. And that's not easy to achieve, and it doesn't happen quickly. I think the media and communications is critically important, but I put the emphasis on the first word there, discreet use. More media is not necessarily good outcomes. It's discreet use of the media that actually brings about movement forward. And sometimes when we think we've been successful because of heavy media coverage, it could in fact be counterproductive if we're not careful. And I'm not one for compromising very much, but I still do think the last point is really about being realistic. And sometimes you won't get exactly what you want to achieve 100%. So you sometimes need to negotiate. There's a bit of give and take in these areas. Some possible problems. I think some of these are a bit similar to what I've just outlined on the last slide, but I think we're really talking about lasting change here. So you can win battles and lose the war. And what we really want to do in successful social policy change in the criminal justice system and broader areas of social policy is lasting change. So you might, win a debate, have a more successful engagement on media, or, criticise someone publicly, but you might win that short term, but we're really looking for long-term lasting change. And conflict is, sometimes necessary, but I think we also sometimes need to be aware that when we have that direct conflict, it can actually harden the resistance. A little example, I never talk about capital punishment in Australia. It's not an issue. And to engage or respond to an invitation to talk about it actually is like putting fuel on the fire. Internationally, fine, but locally, no. So sometimes the conflict can lead to strengthening your enemy or strengthening the opposition. I think there's a real danger of indiscreet use of the public media, which I've touched on already. And also, being prepared to be flexible. I mean, this is what we believe in, this is what we want, and this is the way we're heading, and there's no movement around that. So that inflexibility, or not being prepared to adapt your strategy, especially as the game changes, as it suggested, the parole board has been redefined in Victoria. It's no longer about protecting the community, it's about protecting the government. We don't put people out on parole if they pose a risk. We release them later on without any supervision. So John Barry, who founded the parole board, would turn in his grave. But 90% of the community have bought that message because of the PR people that the government employs. And the last point there, the real goal is about empowerment of our client group, or whatever you like to refer to consumers of the service. It's not about empowerment of ourselves or the organisations we work with. And these can sometimes be confused. I think it really is important, sort of building on the points I've made, really understanding the political process. That means actually understanding the views of your opponents. You might disagree with them, but you've got to understand them. And that takes a bit of homework sometimes, because often we don't want to even understand it because we're so angry or violently opposed to it. But to actually appreciate and understand, be able to articulate yourself, sometimes it's helpful, that old debating process when we're given, okay, what's your position? Okay, well, you're going to be in the affirmative this time rather than the negative. You switch and try to get into the minds of your opponent so you can articulate it. Engage with respect and honesty. I'm repeating that message a little bit. And commitment to bring about lasting change. That's the critical thing. I want to give some examples, some of which I've been involved with, others of which I've admired from a distance, about the sorts of change agencies that are possible that have worked locally and internationally. When I finished working in the prisons in '92, 22 years ago, I helped facilitate the formation of a group called the Victorian Criminal Justice Coalition. It had about 60 members. It included key people at Monash, Melbourne, La Trobe, Deakin, in criminology and psychology. Had, of course, the Victorian Legal Aid, which is a different body then than now, the Law Institute, Bar Council, community legal centres, and so on, religious groups, justice groups in the different denominations, and so on. So it was a broad range of 60 people, and it sort of gained a lot more credibility because of the breadth of the experience around that. I'll explain why I termed that term Catholic prison ministry, an example I'll give later, when I was working as a chaplain. As a chaplain, I was employed and paid by the state government. Catholic prison ministry was a way of escaping that role, if you like. Still took the money, but I could speak as Catholic prison ministry, which was a national network we established, rather than someone who's a public servant, in fact. The third group that I worked with after I left the prisons in the early 90s, it was with a Catholic network that had 110 agencies and about 10,000 staff, about 50,000 volunteers. Didn't have a clear name. It was coordinated by an office called the Episcopal Vicar for Social Welfare. And his office was out at North Ringwood. And I said, you've got to get into the city, we've got to get a clear name, 3 words. And we called ourselves Catholic Social Services. And it represented tens of thousands of workers in the whole field, from birth to death. You would have seen last night on the news, this morning was it, the Australian Lawyers Alliance Greg Barnes. So Greg has formed this network. It's not, he's got a group of people, but it's not Greg Barnes, QC, radical barrister from Tasmania. It's a group of people who are lawyers working for justice in the criminal justice system. It's another example. Smart Justice was formed, I think, the last state election, or the one before. Really important conglomeration of different agencies concerned about these things. Justice Action is a similar group in New South Wales. So you can see the credibility of these groups and the breadth of their involvement and membership becomes really important when you're trying to communicate more broadly. I want to give a couple of examples very quickly, some which worked well and some which didn't work so well. Back in 1988, it was the bicentenary, so-called bicentenary of European settlements, I call it invasion, of the country, and each year the churches had a social justice statement. We ended up convincing the Catholic mob to buy with this topic on the criminal justice system. Got the Anglican mob and the Uniting Church mob and then the Australian Council of Churches. So that is a huge network. I mean, 500,000 copies of this were printed and distributed. Went through, I know the Catholic sector better, 350 Catholic secondary schools, about 400,000 kids use this for a whole term, talking about social justice and human rights. Big numbers, 500,000 copies. The next one, police shootings in Victoria, largely owned by Fleming and Kensington Legal Service. There's the front cover, squeezed to fit the front page, but the bottom line is most important. Largely written for and given a voice to these three families. Mark Militano, Graham Jensen, Jed Horton, three of the people who were first shot by police in Victoria in the late 1980s. There were about 50 more deaths within the next 5 years. They didn't have success straight away. But this was a very powerful network and a real commitment from Clement and Kensington, which lasted, it was 10 years' work. Eventually, Project Beacon retrained the police force. And from 15, 16 being killed every year in Victoria, it went back to about one a year, comparable in New South Wales. There's the prison of last resort. Who's that? What's going on there? That slide. Got any idea what it is?
It's not Ned, is it?
Not Ned. His coffin had broken up. Someone else? Well known. Last name? Ronald Ryan, coming out of the grave at Pentridge 41 years later. After 40 years, the new owners said they'd have a rose garden. Justin Madden, said he'd put up a rose garden. No recognition of the grave sites. I just said to the daughters after about 10 years of discussion, reclaim the body. It's not a prison anymore. How do you do that? Department of Health. And eventually, that's him coming out. And he was finally buried in a funeral service with his three daughters, no one else there, Mandarin Tobins, and cremated and buried with his wife at Portland. But what's this saying about, capital punishment internationally? I was involved with Van Nguyen, the Vietnamese boy who was killed who was executed in Singapore. Next slide, quickly. That was the Commonwealth Games baton. I was asked to run with a baton from the place, the Richmond Flats, where Van and Kwa and his mother Kim lived when they first left the refugee camp in Richmond. I didn't choose the place. Right from where the flats where he lived for the first 2 or 3 years, up to the place where he went to kindergarten and primary school at St Ignatius on the Hill. It's the Commonwealth Games. What's the Commonwealth? What's the thing that holds the Commonwealth together? The common belief in human life. And so the people standing on the side there, those security guards are watching me very closely at that point. But we said, forget about the medal tally. What about the death tally? Singapore's death tally in the last 4 years, 69 lives, I think it was. 69 lives, 9 times the rate of executions of the United States. Not quite up to China. Next couple of slides show some of the media gathering afterwards at Citizens Park. That's Ben Knight there. He's a country boy, and he's over in the States, I think, at the moment. ABC journalist. Some of the people. So that got, major coverage before the Commonwealth Games throughout the country and beyond. Certainly got some hate mail from Singapore. Some of those are consequences. Now I want to give a couple of examples of things that didn't work so well. Just the last one, I forgot that Ned is there. And what brought about that, it took a lot of work. 6 months before, when his body was exhumed by Forensic Services, the owner went to the Supreme Court and said, "It's mine. Forget the family. I want his remains there so I can make a quid out of it." And eventually Robert Clark intervened, one good thing he's done, and said, "No, the body's going to the family." And finally he's buried in an unmarked grave at Greta. We don't have capital punishment in Australia, but in fact we only concerned when there's Australians on death row overseas. But I'm in another network, two of them, World Coalition Against the Death Penalty and Anti-Death Penalty in Asia network. The countries of our region, excluding China, but countries of our region are still executing like mad. So the countries of the Commonwealth, where they inherited it from England, but England got rid of it about the same time we did. It was a news clip on Milburn Age, and that was just talking about some of the things that were going wrong in the old Pentridge at the time. Just want to tell you what happened after that. After that, we got pulled in, the Chaplain's Advisory Committee uniting Anglican and Catholic churches, because we're on salaries from the state government, and they just opened Loddon and Barwon. And we were saying, look, the numbers are going up. We would be helpful if we had some local people that could get some recompense. And we went into the meeting, and the head of prisons, John Griffin, was there, and the minister, Mel Sandon, I think, and they said, look, we've got really bad news. The Treasury's decided that we're going to have to cut back on funding. We walked out, and my boss said, "Oh, that's sad news, Peter." I said, "They're lying through their teeth." You had to know what's going on in this political process. So he said, "What do we do?" I said, "We'll ring Tony Sheen, the Treasurer." Go to Tony 3 days later, he listened to his story, and he said, "Absolute bullshit." He said, "Leave it to me." So we went in next month, called back in for another meeting, said, "Look, we see how upset you were when you left, and we found some money, we're actually going to increase funding by 10%. And I said, "Oh, that's really nice." I didn't let on that I knew what was going on. I didn't put their head in the mud. So that's what I meant about respectful engagement. We won that, but we had to be prepared to lose. And the next example is similar. Two guys, Chris Binns, John Lindray, Acacia, 1 hour exercise on their own, in a yard, absolute no way to escape, in manacles. This is John Van Groningen, who's down in the office down the corridor from me at Pentridge. He's an adjunct professor as well. He rang up my boss and said, the Minister, Pat McNamara, Deputy Premier, is really upset with Nordern, and we're going to withdraw the funding from the Brosnan Centre. It's only 40 grand. Most of it came from community services. And I said, "Did he say that?" And my boss, Kevin Mogg, said yes, so I rang the Deputy Premier's office and I said, "It's being alleged that the Deputy Premier said this. I want a retraction in writing within 24 hours, so I'm going public with it." So I could have gone backwards and said, "Shit, I don't want to lose that 40 grand. But you've got to be prepared to lose that money, point that was made earlier, if there's a matter of principle here. You take a step back, they'll trample on you. So sometimes conflict is appropriate. I had to risk that, and I said, I want a letter from McNamara saying, denying that they're going to take the funding because of advocacy. I got it. But if you lost it, you've got to be prepared to carry on. So sometimes you've got to make those sacrifices and work out, what's going to be possible and ready for the fight. That was a copy. We opened up Pentridge after it closed. When it closed, I said to the Minister, "What's going to happen to the site?" He said, "We're going to sell it." And I said, I want to reopen it. He said, "I thought you wanted to see the place bulldozed." We opened it up. 350,000 people through on public tours. 50,000 copies of this sold, $2 each, with a history. 50,000 school kids with school packages done. Saturation media for 3 months. $2 million profit. Cost us $1 million. We made $2 million profit out of it, but more it wasn't the purpose. The main purpose was community education. 350,000 people, 3-hour experience, and made people think about what we're doing, what's the purpose of imprisonment. Must be ready to finish. So I guess just to conclude, the question we're all asking, my God, when you've been working in the field, as Annie and I have for a while, so I say, my God, it's going backwards. That's still the question. What are we going to do? How are we going to change this? How do we collaboratively, collegially, get more than just the people who are like-minded people like ourselves convinced that we've got to find a better way to deal with complex social needs, and that criminal justice system intervention, a very blunt instrument.